Hello, and welcome to Stephanie's Supply Chain Sit Downs. This episode is a sit down with Mr. Gary Moore, who is the current president and CEO of HEXPOL Compounding Americas and the former chief procurement officer of HEXPOL. Today, we're going to be talking about procurement and a couple other topics related to procurement strategies. Here is our sit down.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could give me a little bit of overview of your time in supply chain and like your favorite role that you've had so far.
Okay, so yeah, when I started my career, I actually started out in a technical background and was working for a global company. And after 7 years, I had the opportunity to go into a purchasing department, which at that time I felt, well, I know nothing about purchasing. It doesn't sound like a career path that I want to take. And somebody convinced me, not only through a letter offer, but also with just discussions that I had. And I spent from the last 20 years in a procurement role. So up until basically 2019 is when I worked in supply chain. Started out as a strategic purchase engineer, which was very enjoyable. So that part of the job was actually going to suppliers and doing some improvements to their processes and basically trying to engineer cost out. So this was a process. You would build a strategic relationship with a supplier, go to them, look at the process, and give a real value add, value engineering review of their process to see if you could engineer cost out. And if we made an improvement over costs, they would share the benefits. So we would say that 50% we would take and 50% would go to their bottom line. So it kind of a joint development program. And that worked for about 2 years. So the strategic vendor development was a very interesting and enjoyable job because you got to travel the world, got to see all these companies. It's challenging because you're going into somebody's workplace and then telling them all the things that they're doing wrong. So that was an interesting role. But after 2 years of doing that, it kind of gets to a point where you've basically gone through all the supply chain. So that moved into basically looking after certain raw materials. For me, that was searching for options to basically either improve or engineer cost out or have contingency planning for certain products that we were buying. And that role then progressed into a manager's role, which then progressed into a chief procurement officer, which then led to where I am today, which is president and CEO of a global company. So the whole process for me is invaluable. When you look at supply chain, there are multifacets of things that you can do, including supply chain, which I think goes hand in hand with procurement. So when you're evaluating suppliers, the approach that I always take was total cost of acquisition. I think a lot of people in purchasing, especially buyers in their early part of their career, look at lowest cost, but is it truly lowest cost? And so when you're evaluating that, you have to not only buy the product, but you have to get it to your location. You have to do everything that's in association with buying that item. And when it comes to it, there's a lot of hidden things that maybe, if you buy it internationally or from an import perspective, there may be duties or levies. There's freight involved with that. So when you're looking at a product, it has to be landed cost. And the other part of lowest cost is not always the best option when you can't get the item. Sometimes suppliers will quote items, maybe not without an intention, but if you can't get the product, the zero cost means, or let's say when you're buying something, you have to have that item. And so a lot of procurement nowadays is based on I would say contingency planning. So it's always good to have a backup source. If you're buying a certain product, make sure that you have an alternative product available and you've done your research. So that's part and parcel of the procurement or supply chain process.
Well, it sounds like you've had like a really cool career in procurement and that you've done a lot of things, which is really cool to hear about. And so I was wondering, like, what has been one of the most challenging parts of like being in procurement, and especially when you said you were chief procurement officer running procurement
Yep.
for a global company.
Yeah, so I would say the biggest challenge is basically finding something that is sometimes not available. We've had instances. So in my instance, where we make rubber compounds, it's like making a cake. You get all of these ingredients and mix it together, and then you have a cake mixture. When you're making a cake mixture, you cannot forget one of the ingredients. You know, if you're making a cake, you need the flour and the eggs and the yeast, all of those elements that make the cake. And it's very similar in rubber processing, with constraints of certain products. Some of the products that we use are restricted or hazardous materials, and I would say the biggest challenge I've come across is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, have outlawed or restricted some of these products, and now we rely on certain areas like either Far East or China or other Eastern Asian areas to bring products. And if you, like you say, if you have 14 of the 15 ingredients, you still cannot make the final product. So we've encountered challenges within the supply chain in certain times of the year. For example, in China, when the Olympics was run in 2008, they put a restriction on those products that were being produced that we utilized that only came from China because of the Olympics. They wanted to demonstrate on the television that the air was clean and the atmosphere was wonderful. And so those products actually ceased production. And if you do not have those products, you cannot make your product. And so the challenges that we've certainly encountered is non-availability of product. And then just recently, we also had supply chain issues. So a lot of the ships that are carrying such products around the world are these mega ships, and they hold a lot of containers, but the ports that receive those don't actually have the infrastructure to unload them in a timely manner. So we've seen a lot of port congestion, a lot of challenges of bringing stuff in and basically getting it on time delivery. And within supply chain, you know, part of your remit or part of your role is to determine what is the right inventory level to hold so that you have safety stock. Now, from a financial perspective, the more stock you have, the worse it becomes for the company to have that type of stock inventory. I mean, it's the working capital. So we try to minimize that as much as possible. But if you minimize that and then you have a delay and then something doesn't arrive, the cost of the business is far greater than holding a little bit of inventory. So it's a fine balance always within the procurement team in trying to establish what is the best practice.
Makes sense. And then has COVID and like the Russia-Ukraine war affected the supply chain of rubber as well and all
Yes,
of that?
absolutely. So just taking, for example, Russia as an instance, a lot of the material that we use for reinforcing rubber is a product called carbon black, and that is an oil-based product. You basically burn oil and it makes like a charcoal, and that material is used to reinforce rubber. It provides strength to the rubber. And Russia is a major producer of carbon black. Now, when you have restrictions or governments that embargo or restrict product coming into the region, that creates an issue in terms of, again, supply, but not only supply, but also cost, you know, cost of availability. When there's a lot of material available, cost generally goes down. And when limited availability is there and you have lots of people competing for the same product. So it has a huge impact on your business. And so right now, you know, Russia is restricted product. We cannot even use that material. So now we have to rely on either domestic production or other offshore sources. And that requires technical qualification, validation, and a lot of other things that you don't consider when you're just, you know, using such products that goes into a rubber compound.
That makes sense. And have you any like of the lessons that you have learned from like obviously COVID and then Russia, like the supply chain disruptions, have you been able to use them and do you continue to use them today in your company?
So I think from our standpoint, what COVID did, and also these geopolitical issues, is that we generally look for more domestic sources. Where we can, we buy from. If it's in the US, then we buy in the US. If it's from mainland Europe, we buy in mainland Europe. That has a positive impact also on sustainability. As a company, we're a listed company, and the prerequisites of reducing the CO2 footprint are growing. And if you take a product and you actually buy it locally, that has a lesser impact on the environment because you're not using freight to move material from one region to another and then transporting that within the country. So the main takeaway that we've taken from basically the challenges that we have is buy as close as you can. Now, it's not always possible to do that. Like you say, there's certain restrictions on products, but for the most part, we try to, like I say, minimize the constraints or issues relating to those products or insourcing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like hopefully that helps with some of the supply chain issues. And then obviously sustainability is huge.
100%. And when it comes to business, again, from a procurement strategy, I think a lot of older generation look for lowest cost, but actually supporting companies that are domestic has a positive influence on the economy. It's actually, if you look at something like the UK, which was a manufacturing environment for many years, because it became, let's say, uncost competitive against other regions. The UK is a net importing region for products, which actually, restricts the number of jobs, it restricts the availability. And if you look at the UK now, manufacturing is not the largest business. It's the service industry, which I think, when you look at it from a business perspective, you want that fine balance between manufacturing and services, and you don't have all your eggs in one basket. So supporting the local and domestic economy is far greater than engineering a little bit of cost out. I think sometimes.
That makes sense. It's a lot of important things. And then I know you mentioned sustainability. So when you're procuring, what do you think is like one of the biggest barriers to work, like trying to be more sustainable with procurement? And then what is like one way to like try to be more sustainable, like through procurement as well?
Okay, so from our standpoint right now, procurement is very much focused on the energy that we acquire. So if you look at how sustainability is broken down and to emissions are broken down, there are basically three scopes: scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 is basically energy that you're using and how you conserve your energy. Scope 3 then looks at some of the products that you're using. So right now, our biggest effort that we are focused on is reducing our CO2 emissions footprint by 70%, 75% by 2025. And the way that we are able to do that is to look at energy sources. So we are reducing our dependency on fossil fuels, and the procurement team is responsible then for finding energy sources that are, I would say, cleaner than fossil fuel. So we're, like I say, we're reducing our dependency on fossil fuel. But if you look to other sources, wind and solar are classified as green energy. Also, clean energy can come from nuclear. Nuclear is not as good as wind or solar, but it's better than fossil fuels. So again, looking at ways to procure energy, which is actually a very, very hard task in the US right now. When you work with energy companies, their progress is not as great as somewhere like a region like Europe. Europe, if you look to them, yes, there is much more solar, wind energy, water energy, also nuclear. In the US, I think over the last couple of years, we've seen an improvement of about 1 to 2%, which is actually very slow progress. There is a mindset that we are not as far as advanced as we should be. And when we look to buy material, it depends if the area is restricted. If you're working with an energy company that has a network, do they have the availability of such products? So we've established a timeline from 2019, which was our baseline, to 2025. And by the end of this year, we would see a reduction of around 45% on CO2. In the future, from a sustainability standpoint, we will be looking into more products like recycled products, or taking products to be able to cradle to grave, and how to reuse products that have come to their end of their lifespan, which I think there's a lot more technology required, or a lot more advancement needed to be able to get to a position not only to use that products, but also the conversion of the end of life products to the final product. If you look at the plastics industry, very far advanced. You can recycle plastic, and you can reuse plastic. From a rubber standpoint, it's much more challenging. When you apply heat to rubber and you make it into a final product, you actually cross-link it and actually have to break that down. Plastics, you just regrind and chip it, and you can use it again. So you add heat, it melts, and it reforms in the same way that it would do. So, from our standpoint, we are looking at post-consumer waste, value streams that be able to get that. But not only that, how do we then convert that back into a raw material that we can use in rubber compound? So, yeah, scope 3 is definitely the single largest opportunity for improvement. But at the same time, the infrastructure is not there to be able to utilize that product right now.
That's really interesting. It's interesting that you said that like the US isn't as far in sustainable like energy as like Europe is, and I had no idea about that. That's really
Yeah,
wild.
yeah, it is a very like you say, from a global company's perspective, Europe is definitely leading the way from the sustainability efforts. I think they have more aggressive goals. They do a lot more in terms of environmental studies on certain products. The restrictions on those products are much greater than North America. You have something called ROHS, which is restricted of hazardous substances. And if you look to Europe, they have a program called REACH, and a lot of materials that are banned in Europe can still be used in the US. Which, again, it's kind of interesting to see that we remain behind an area such like Europe, and you think it would be a global standard. And right now, the challenge with sustainability is you have a lot of companies that are basically kind of greenwashing. They're making statements that are saying, yes, use our product because it's sustainable, but there's no empirical data to back that up. And I think, come 2024, 2025, we'll have international standards that avoids or restricts companies with their statements, which I think is long overdue. Everybody has good intentions to be a more sustainable, but you have to provide not only a baseline, but then governance to how you measure that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I hope that they make those guidelines in the near future for internationally. That'd be really good. I guess I have another question for you, kind of turning away from sustainability. Where do you see supply chain going in the next like 5-10 years? Whether that's like trends or technologies or anything else that you see?
Okay, so from the supply chain standpoint, certainly we're seeing improvements in logistics. That the paramount piece that we talked about of making sure that you have product. Once upon a time, you would place a purchase order, and you would have notifications of when the material arrived. From a supply chain standpoint, now you have GPS positioning. You can track, packages from when it gets dispatched to right to the door, to make just in time production much easier. And then those advancements continuously improve on a day per day basis. So we continuously work with our supply chain partners to see what is out there, what are improvements to make our business more efficient. And I think that is important. If you're in a procurement, supply chain is paramount when you're looking at developments and how you make improvements. Overall, I think the industry is moving forward, but I would still say that we're governed and restricted in certain instances.
And I guess on that governance and restrictions, do you think that there needs to be like more governance and restrictions, or like there needs to be some standards set internationally, or?
I think from an international standpoint, it would be wonderful. The challenge with the US is that you can get state policy, you can get a country policy, And with an administration change, that also changes the cycle. If to break it down, and again, I'm not going to get political on it, but if you look at one certain party, they will be driving towards more of a manufacturing policy and driving for local jobs and production domestically. But if you look at another party, then it's more about EPA compliance and restricting some of these products, and that pushes product offshore, which again has its counterintuitive things. So as we go into this next cycle of administration, possibly changing from a into a republic or a democratic party, that can have a huge swing on your business. So that every 4 years, our business generally looks to say, okay, how is this cycle going to impact our business going forward? And you wouldn't expect to have such a significant impact on your business, but it does. And sometimes we move forward, and sometimes it feels like we move backwards.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, so you've started in the company has started to look at potential cycle changes and administrative changes as of now, just to prepare.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We start to look right now, about 1 year in advance of what is happening. We always have a keen eye on in terms of what is potentially going to happen. Contingency planning, like I say, is probably you want to mitigate risk. So in terms of having a backup solution or an alternative supply solution is always at the forefront of everybody's mind right now. If this happens, what do we do? If this happens, what do we do? So you're always pre-planning for the event that something will change, and the likeliness and the history says that change is inevitable. So from that standpoint, as a business, you have to look at those contingency plans to basically make sure that the business continues as is, or progresses, or moves forward in a positive manner.
That makes sense. And that's really interesting as well to hear about. And then I just have one final question for you as well. So part of my podcast is trying to figure out what students in supply chain who are currently studying supply chain and logistics and procurement and all of that should know about the future. So I was wondering, what do you think students studying supply chain should know about entering the workforce, or procurement, or logistics, or any of that?
That's a great question. I think legislation, in understanding legislation and impacts to like you say, the world from a green perspective is going to advance on a rapid pace now. With all the policies and all of the changes, it's imperative that individuals understand those impacts. And right up until now, there's going to be a major shift into 2024 in terms of policy that will have a major influence. Again, going back to talk about sustainability, but you could up until this year buy RECs, which are renewable energy credits. So if you didn't have the ability to secure energy that is non-fossil fuel, you had the possibility to buy a credit that was an investment into a renewable energy investment. So you don't buy it, but you're buying a REC that would add money to a positive influence to the environment. And those could be used to offset your carbon footprint. However, policy change as of January 1 will be that those renewable energy credits have no impact on your CO2 footprint. So all of a sudden, a company has invested a significant amount of money into renewable energy credits that would offset their CO2 footprint. And as of January 1, that has zero impact on their CO2 footprint. So it's important that you really understand what is happening, but also that you're addressing the root cause. In the reality, buying a credit really isn't addressing your CO2 footprint. So I'm glad the policy is changing. At the same time, for all those companies that took the decision to enter into that, have basically wasted a lot of money. So, these policies keep changing. There are a lot of seminars, webinars out there, and from a student perspective, what I would say is that follow those webinars, follow those symposiums, go to expos, have those discussions with supply chain partners, talk about procurement based systems, because that is going to be the future, and you have to adapt accordingly.
That makes sense, and that's really interesting to hear. That's kind of all the questions I have. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Mr. Moore. It was really great to hear about your experience in supply chain and procurement, your experiences, your outlook on the future, and everything else. It was really great to learn about all of that.
No problem. Enjoyed talking to you today. And again, it's always an interesting. There's never a dull moment in procurement. I can assure you. Like I say, with 20 years experience in purchasing, there's certainly some highs and there's certainly some lows and everything in between. So good luck to you. I hope everything goes well, and looking forward to hearing about other people in the supply chain and procurement activities as well.
Of course, thank you so much. And
Thank you again to Mr. Moore for sitting down with me and talking procurement, issues getting production supplies, sustainable procurement, and international regulations. For more episodes and sit downs, you can visit my podcast page, Stephanie's Supply Chain Sit Downs, on Spotify. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.